I can get this going here. We are going to talk today about the 1988 presidential election and then the uh, George H.W. Bush as our president from 1988 through 1992. So, when we were last together, we talked about the Cold War, so we've kind of already talked a little bit about Bush and some of the things that he did when he was president. So, I want to start today talking about um, how he became president. So, we know that in 1988, we're going to have, a candidate from the Republican Party and a candidate from the Democrats because Reagan has fulfilled his constitutional limit and cannot run again. And so the natural choice is going to be Bush, who was Reagan's vice president. Um, he, had that experience. And as we're going to talk about here in a minute, he had a lot of experience. I've heard him being described as probably the most experienced um, president since Teddy Roosevelt in all the different capacities that he held. Um, and he went ahead and chose kind of an up and coming Republican, and that was Dan Quayle, who was the one of the senators from Indiana. Didn't have a ton of experience, but he was, pretty well liked. I would equate him to kind of along the same lines of Mike Pence today. Um, One of the big things that Bush and Quayle did was to promise no new taxes. When Bush finally comes out as the winner, the primaries in both the Republican and the Democratic Party is going to be pretty heated. Kind of like it was, you probably didn't pay too much attention, but in 2016, when both parties are trying to come up with a new candidate, um, it's going to get pretty heated between different different groups. And so when Bush gets the nomination at his acceptance speech, he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And this is going to be very appealing to a lot of people because of the kind of still a little bit of fluctuation um, in the economy, even though, we had the Reaganomics, we had the supply side, um, and some people were, benefiting from this, but then there were still a lot that were not. Um, he also, being Bush, is going to run a very negative campaign when it comes to his opponent. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So, who is going to be Bush's opponent? And that's going to be Michael Dukakis, who was at that time the governor of Massachusetts. He is going to come out on top in the Democratic primaries. Really strong contender for the Democrats was Jesse Jackson. Um, and this is going to be kind of, the height of Jesse Jackson's popularity. But Michael Dukakis is going to get that nomination and choose Lloyd Bentsen, one of the senators from the great state of Texas, to be his running mate. Um, he is going to campaign that he's, an average guy. He's the son of Greek immigrants who's worked his way up, and now he's the governor of Massachusetts. Anybody can do it. I sympathize with you. One of those kinds of campaigns. And he is going to campaign, with the attitude of that increasing government spending, and primarily in different areas such as healthcare, child care, housing, education, a lot of those social issues that a lot of people are going to be struggling with during this time. Um, and one of the things that Bush is going to do is going to label him as a, you know, liberal Democrat, the typical, and I'm using air quotes on that, liberal Democrat. And he does fit that bill. Two of the other things that are going to be negative but very effective for Bush is he's going to uh, make will use two things that Dukakis did against him. And one of them, let's talk about this one right here, is going to he's going to say that Dukakis wants to cut defense spending. And remember, we're still in the Cold War at this time, um, and the attitude of Reagan and Bush was to increase defense spending, to kind of deter the communists and try to put that pressure on the communists and primarily Soviet Union um, to change their ways. And so Dukakis is going to use this publicity stunt. He's going to get in a tank. I know you can't really see it in this image, but cuts it off. But he's going to get in a tank and he's going to kind of ride around. He's going to say, look, hey, I can be your commander in chief. And he is a relatively short man. And when he gets in this tank, this massive tank, he looks really, really, really small. And then he puts this helmet on, and it just, was this very striking piece of imagery that, he's not up to, being this commander in chief where you have George Bush, who's, well over 6 foot tall and been in the military, as we're going to talk about, and then just quite the opposite. So this is a really big image. The other thing that Bush is going to do is use this program of that Dukakis was instituting in Massachusetts of letting uh, people in prison for various crimes out of jail for the week or for a day, and they would go and do a job, kind of assimilating them back into society. Well, which was popular, and of course Bush was, they did the crime, they must do the time, and he was even for the death penalty. But one of these gentlemen that were furloughed, for the time period, put on this program, is going to be a man by the name of Willie Horton. And Willie Horton was in jail for a felony murder. And he is going to, while he's out, he's going to commit another crime. And it is going to just blow right back in the face of Dukakis. And Bush is going to say, look, he's going to let all these criminals out of jail. And, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. And you can't let this happen. And so things that he did are going to kind of come back on him. And it was very effective. And you can see that, boom, 426 to 111, very easily 54% to 46%, and that's a solid win. And so here's Dan Quayle and here's George Bush, and you can see I went ahead and put this image on there. There's Gorbachev and Reagan and Bush, and this is going to be carrying on, this relationship, this perestroika, this glasnost, this openness to, working together, having this friendly relationship, and eventually bringing an end to the Cold War. So he's sworn in 1989. So let's learn a little bit about George Bush. So here's some pictures that we have, and we'll kind of flip back and forth between the two as we go. Okay, so George was born in 1924 in Massachusetts. He was named after his grandfather, and everybody called his grandfather Pop. And so, because he's, named after him and he was younger, he got the nickname Poppy, and this stuck with him his entire life. And when he does become a grandfather himself, I mean, that's what everybody called him, Poppy. It does after, shortly after he was born, his family moves to Kennebunkport, Maine. He does come from wealth, yes, both on his mother and father's side. Um, uh, one was in stocks and in banking, and then the other one was in corporations and running businesses and things like that. So um, pretty well off. And he does attend Phillips Academy. Very very um, good education. It's an all boys school. Um, and while he's there, he excels. He's the president of the senior class. He plays baseball. He plays soccer. He's just a really well liked young man. But that, he's a senior in 1942, and we know that that's, we're just getting into the war. And so on his 18th birthday, right after he graduates, he does enlist in the Navy, and he wants to, fly jets. He wants to be an aviator. And he is going to succeed, and he's going to be one of the youngest naval aviators in their history, in our nation's history. And so he goes off, and he's going to serve in the Pacific Theater. He is going to be shot down, and several of his crewmates are going to die in the crash in the Pacific. Several of them are going to be captured, and some of them are actually executed, and then, as the story goes, they were eaten by their captors, because you're out there on an island, and you, your food supply might be pretty limited. But George was rescued, and he received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroics. Um, and he flies several other missions. When the war is over, he is going to, when he, finishes his tour, he comes home, he marries his sweetheart, Barbara Pierce, and they eventually have 6 children. So if we go back to some of the pictures, here he is, just a couple years older than you guys. He's out there flying airplanes. Here he is on his wedding day with Barbara. And here they are eventually with their 5 surviving children. Their oldest daughter, Robin, is going to pass away, unfortunately, at the age of 3 from leukemia. And till the day he died, George carried a picture of her on his person. Very profoundly affected both him and Barbara. So after he gets out of the military, he is going to go to Yale, and he goes not only on the GI Bill, as we've already talked about, but his family has a history of Yale graduates. And he goes, and he just excels. He's captain of the baseball team. He also is a cheerleader, which his son George is going to go there and is a cheerleader also. There's George right there. So he does very well, very, very well liked, not only by his peers, but also by the staff. And so when he does finish, he decides that he wants to get out from his father's shadow and his wife's family shadow. And, he could have gone into banking, he could have done a lot of those things, but he decides to move all the way out to Texas, Midland, Texas, and works in the oil industry, which is really booming during this time. Does very well, moves to Houston, and he is going to start his own oil company with a couple other friends. It's called Zapata Oil Industry or Oil Company, and be very, very successful. And so while he's living in Houston, he is going to start to get involved in politics. And so if we go back here, and whoops, wrong way. He's going to start to get involved in politics again. And so one of the first things he does is he is chosen as the leader uh, of his local Republican Party, and then he is going to run, and he goes straight for the top. Okay, he runs for the United States Senate. Going from nothing to really being a senator, huge, representing your whole state. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, but unfortunately, he is running against an incumbent who's been there for a while. So he loses. And then in 66, he runs for representative and he wins. Um, he is going to be one of those fiscal conservatives. So he wants very small government. He doesn't, um, you know, agree with some of the things that Lyndon Johnson is doing, and a fellow Texan, as we've already talked about. Um, and so and one of the other things that he doesn't agree with Johnson on is civil rights, and because he believes that it's the individual's responsibility, not the government, stepping in and telling you, and it should be the individual. It's not that George Bush was um, a segregationist, not in any way, shape, or form, but he believes that it's the individual that should be doing that. In 1970, he does take a shot at the Senate again, but he loses. But now when he was in the House of Representatives and he was elected twice for that, he serves on a very, very important committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, which deals with any kind of uh, taxes bills that begin in the House have to originate in that committee. So he's really makes a name for himself. And so, uh, after he loses this race, Nixon, who is the president at this time, is going to appoint him the ambassador to the UN. And here he is in that capacity right there. He is going to, carry out that attitude of Nixon and Henry Kissinger of détente. Very important job. So he gets, not only does he have, domestic experience, now he's getting foreign experience. And then he is going to be called home in 1972 for that presidential election, and he is made the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Their job is to make sure that the Republicans, keep control or win control of the House and the Senate. So it's a really important job, and also coordinate with the Republican candidate, which is going to be Nixon. So he's successful in getting Nixon reelected, and he is going to be appointed shortly thereafter to be the liaison to China. And this is going to be one of his favorite jobs. In his memoir that he had, of all the jobs that he's going to have, this is one of his favorite. He just loved being there and the responsibilities, and then the improvement. Because remember, again, this is détente. It's a good relationship that we're building with China. But then he is appointed the director of the intelligence agency. So he becomes in charge of the CIA. But unfortunately, what's going to happen is that at the end of 1976, Ford is going to lose. And so Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, comes in, and he, gets replaced. And so for the first time in a long time, he doesn't have a public service job. So now he's going to start focusing on running for president. He feels like he's ready for this. And so he seeks the nomination in 1980. He does not get it. And Reagan then taps him to be his vice president. And of course, we know what happens in 1980. So here's Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy. Here's Barbara, and George, and here's the president and the vice president. All right, so now we have a little background. We know what happens. He's vice president during the 80s, and so now he becomes president. The Democrats, though, are going to win both seats in the House and in the Senate, and the majority in both of those. And so, as we know, this is divided government. So it's going to be pretty hard for him to get really anything put in place. And you can, see that on the news today. Bush working with Pelosi is, you don't get a lot accomplished. One of the things, and so let's just real quickly talk about a couple of the major things that happen on the domestic side. One of the things that he does is because he is a conservative, but he can't get a lot of conservative pieces of legislation passed. He's going to start a program called 1,000 Points of Light, and what he is hoping to do with this is to encourage people to be a point of light to those that are disabled, illiterate, or poor, and taking on the individuals, volunteers, taking on those responsibilities instead of maybe the government doing everything. It was a very, liked program. Those, people got recognized, people volunteered, people really, it was a hit. Another thing that he did was in July of 1990, he's going to sign the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And here he is right here signing it. This is kind of a modern, up-to-date, whatever you call it. I can't think of what it is, like a symbol or, their logo that they use. And again, as you can read there, it's intended to ensure that persons with disabilities would receive the same opportunities in employment and access to public places, transportation, and, make people who have disabilities full and equal members in society. So it's very important, still around today. This year it's celebrating, 30 years, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this, landmark piece of legislation over the summer. So the rest of the time today we're going to talk real quickly about his foreign policy, because this is where he really makes a name for himself. We've really already talked about his role in, ending communism. Here he is, continuing the work of Reagan with Gorbachev, and here's Boris Yeltsin, again, signing different agreements to scale down, even eliminate certain types of nuclear weapons. And so he is really going to, communism falls under his presidency, not Reagan, but Reagan lays all the groundwork. Another area that he is going to tackle is in Latin America, and one of the things that is going to happen during the 80s is that drug use is going to be quite heavy. The First Lady during the 80s, Nancy Reagan, is actually going to start, the program. Her project that she takes on as First Lady is Just Say No to Drugs. And so he's going to continue that. He actually, declares war, and use those air quotes, on drugs, like we're at war with terrorism right now. And two of the main places in which drugs, especially cocaine, is coming into the United States was from Colombia and from Panama. And we're going to go after Romero in Colombia, but the big catch was in December of 1989, when he sends in this large number of troops into Panama and to take down Manuel Noriega. And here he is right here. He is the kind of military dictator, but he's also, the drug lord. He's in charge of the uh, drug cartel in Panama. And so we, bring him back to the United States. We try him. He's convicted and he's sentenced to 40 years in prison. And I believe in 2017 he was in his mid 80s and does die. And but this was a great big victory. A lot of people thought, oh well, we're going to break up these drug cartels, and we know how well that goes over. But he does put a dent in it. In regards to China, when this, as we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, um, well, as we've already talked about, what was going on in the fall of communism, that's going to inspire Chinese students who are living under a communist regime to stage pro-democracy protests. And they're going to do that in their square, their main square, called Tiananmen Square. And that's kind of like what they have in Moscow, the Kremlin. It's a large, like what we would call um, uh, the green space, the mall outside of, between the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial. That would be just this huge gathering area. And so Chinese, students are going to gather there. We kind of sat back and watched. We hoped that these protests would be, put some pressure on communist control, but that all, goes away on June 4th when the communist regime is going to send in tanks. So here's Tiananmen Square. You can see, just thousands and thousands and thousands of young people gathering together, giving speeches, talking about democracy, talking about, those natural liberties that you have, natural rights that you have. And this is a very iconic image of just this young man, and he's got two kind of grocery bags full of all his belongings, and he just is standing up, the average man standing up to, this totalitarian government, and ultimately he does, the tank is going to go right up to him, and he does climb up on top, and but there are thousands, that are going to die because of what the military is going to do. They're just going to run over people. In other instances, many people are going to be imprisoned. And it's just this brute show of force. The Bush administration is going to condemn the actions, but we do continue our economic and diplomatic ties, and we do try to work through the situation. And ultimately, we know that the protesters are going to win some freedoms. And again, that was a 30-year celebration last year, and every year around that time, they do, it is brought back up and talked about, the stand that these Chinese students took. So he doesn't really get involved, but and the same thing kind of holds true here in South Africa. So we know, as you guys studied last year, they had apartheid, the segregation between the races, and so again, student protests are going to be started in the late 80s. And many American firms are going to start to divest. That means they're going to start withdrawing their investments to show that support for the end of apartheid and equality, just this whole movement throughout the world. Congress is going to impose economic sanctions, but we don't fully divest. So we still have, businesses that are happening. We still buy products from this very segregated society. And this man right here, as you guys may remember from last year, Nelson Mandela, he'd been in prison. He was imprisoned in 1962 for his actions trying to end apartheid. He's going to be freed in 1990 because of some of these actions that, not only the United States, but other countries were taking. And so Bush is going to invite him to the White House. They're going to, talk about things. And this is a big show of support for this, again, putting pressure on South Africa. And ultimately, the apartheid rules are going to go away, and he's going to be elected president of South Africa. So, big. We did play a role in this, even though it wasn't necessarily a direct role, but the image of us supporting this is going to help bring an end to apartheid. Two other areas in which human rights are going to be an issue. One would be Yugoslavia. We talked about how it is going to, fall away from communism. But as we talked about at the end of, World War II, at the end of World War I, they're going to just throw together all these Slavic peoples. And you have Croatians, you have Herzegovinians, you have Bosnians, you have just Serbians are going to just be grouped together under Yugoslavia, and held together by the communists. And when the communist regime is toppled, things fall apart. And so they basically have a civil war, and we do not intervene. We do, send some troops in when the UN tries to bring peace, but that is going to happen pretty much at the end of Bush's tenure in office. And so a lot of that is going to fall to Bill Clinton, and we'll talk about that in another. But in Somalia, again, right at the end of Bush's term as president, we're going to have, and we know that this is in the eastern part of Northern Africa, we're going to have, warlords that are going to be fighting, and the way that they, tried to get people on their side was, to starve them. And the UN is going to try to send in, food and supplies, that humanitarian aspect of it, as we've already talked about. When we talked about the creation of the UN, the United States Marines are going to get involved, Operation Restore Hope. But again, a lot of this, and by this time, Bush is lost. And so he doesn't really get to make his mark there, but Bill Clinton will. One area in which he does really make his mark is in a little bit further to the east and in the Persian Gulf. This man right here is a man by the name of Saddam Hussein, and he has been in control of Iraq, which used to be Persia, which is just full of oil. He is going to, on August 2nd, 1990, he's going to send in, a huge number of troops to Kuwait, which is just to the south, very oil-rich country itself. What we were afraid of is that, if he has oil supplies and now he's going to take Kuwait's oil supplies, he would be in control of about 20% of the world's oil. He really, really could, inflict, some economic damage and hardships on a lot of the world. So we were afraid that, once he gets a hold of those two countries, he could look to the West, and our big ally of Saudi Arabia is right there. And so we are going to act in defense of Saudi Arabia and also of Kuwait. But what Bush is going to do is he's going to build this coalition. He's going to kind of use his diplomatic skills to try to convince the UN that we need to do something about this. And so in late fall of 1990, the UN is going to, issue a resolution to Iraq saying, get out of Kuwait. And if you don't, then we're going to do something about it. And what they start to do is they build up this UN coalition where it's mainly United States. They're going to be assembled in Saudi Arabia, and this is not going to go over too well. And this operation is going to, when Saddam Hussein refuses to leave, it escalates to the next level, Operation Desert Storm. And this man right here, Norman Schwarzkopf, and Colin Powell, we've already talked about him. Remember his role in the My Lai massacre. He investigated it, are going to be in charge of this. And so what's going to happen is for the first 5 weeks, we are going to bomb the snot out of them. Just bomb, 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 bomb. Not only in Iraq, but also in where their troops are amassed in Kuwait. And then we are going to, the troops will, be sent in, overrun. And within 5 days, the Iraqi troops are going to be surrendering. They're going to be fleeing, and a deal, a ceasefire is brokered. And you can see just the heavy loss of life on the Iraqi side to, the American lives that were lost. And so what happens is we drive them back to the Iraqi border, but we don't cross. We don't go in, because what George Bush does is he says, our mission was to get him out of Kuwait, and that's all we want. We do establish a no-fly zone, and we kind of, patrol over Iraq to make sure that, because we were afraid that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, that he would be using them, launching them from Iraq. And so this is not going to bode very well for Bush afterwards. Hindsight is 2020, but at the time, oh my gosh, Bush's popularity is well over 90%. People think that he's done the right thing. We flexed our muscle. We showed him, kind of thing. But we didn't make too many friends in the Middle East. There were going to be a lot of Iraqis that resented our presence in the Middle East. And so did a large number of Saudis. And actually, again, because this is perceived as, the West coming in, they have their Christianity, they have their, modern ways of doing things, and we don't want to be westernized. And so what's actually going to happen is there is a group that had been started, it's been around for a while, Al-Qaeda, and this is where they are really going to, their numbers are going to shoot up, all right? And the dislike for us by many in this area is going to be a result of our stepping in this situation. So that brings us right up to the 1992 presidential election. And again, we can't talk about everything. These are just kind of the high points of George Bush's presidency. And so the next time we will meet, we will talk about the 1992 presidential election. You should be able to answer all the questions on your worksheet. We'll talk to you later.